We're going to talk this afternoon about working with people who've experienced sexual violence. It will be an interactive segment on the program, and I invite you to enjoy a little bit of conversation with one another, as well as with me. A little bit of movement later on, if you're game. And let's see, we might even see if we can have some fun along the way. Okay, so I'm going to start with a kind of working title of PTSD arising from sexual violence. And starting with a diagnosable disorder is kind of a really curious place for me to start. And the reason it's curious is because most of the people that I work with wouldn't ever have a conversation with me about PTSD or about any disorders at all. The reason for this is I much prefer to work in a way that doesn't preference a Western medical kind of perspective on the impacts of sexual violence. But for the conversation that we're going to have today, PTSD kind of provides a structure that can help us to organise our conversation about the impacts of sexual violence. But we're going to approach the conversation in a way that's a little bit different to how the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that fabulously comforting bedtime storybook that we all know and love, I'm sure. We're going to approach it excuse me, in more of a lived experience kind of way. So my aim is to get you all out of the door at afternoon tea time with kind of a sense of what the impacts of sexual violence feel like to a person who's experiencing them, okay? We're also going to take the opportunity to elect ourselves as very eminent psychiatrists, and we're going to critique the work of the very eminent American psychiatrists who developed the current iteration of post-traumatic stress disorder that's in the DSM-5. So we're going to critique the diagnostic criteria, and we're also going to look at some research and raise some questions about traditional models of therapeutic engagement with people who've experienced sexual violence. And when I say traditional models of therapy or traditional models of therapeutic engagement with people who've experienced sexual violence, please know that I'm not just talking about the sorts of therapy that goes on in a consulting room at 2 p.m. every Wednesday where people eyeball one another and talk about their feelings. That's not the only sort of therapeutic endeavour. Case management, community development work, all of these different sorts of roles are therapeutic endeavours, and I hope that what I'm going to share with you today can be very easily kind of rolled into those roles in ways that benefit people who've experienced sexual violence. How does that sound for a roadmap of the next hour or so? Okay? Great. Okay, so here is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, number 5, diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. There are essentially 5 criteria. The first one is event descriptors. So event descriptors say things like if you've experienced X, Y, or Z, then you can be traumatised by those events and therefore you can be diagnosed with a diagnosis of PTSD. What's really interesting about that is that the DSM is trying to set some sort of a benchmark about what sort of experiences in life can be legitimately called traumatic events and what sort of events in life cannot be legitimately called traumatic events. I have a different opinion to that, okay? I would say that traumatisation is a subjective experience, and the experiences that we have in life can be vastly different, and according to vast individual factors, the relative kind of impact of those events will be different across different people. So what might be traumatic for me may not be traumatic for you. What might be traumatic for you may be, a little stressful for me. So I think that whilst I understand the DSM trying to put a benchmark, some sort of a threshold, because bear in mind that the DSM is an American text at its heart and therefore is a very informative text in terms of insurance payouts for treatment, okay? So, but I would say that in actual fact, human experience is very, very varied. the factors that influence whether or not a person is traumatised by something that happened is also very, very individual in nature. And there are many, many people who I have had the pleasure of working with who have had events that are above that benchmark of what should be considered trauma and haven't been traumatised by those events. And equally, I've worked with many, many people who have experienced life events that sit underneath that threshold for traumatisation. And my golly, yes, they have been traumatised by those events. So I guess I encourage you to hold the threshold and the benchmarks around traumatisation that are authoritative in our society lightly. And what I prefer to do is I prefer to hold instead what's in front of me, what are the impacts that this person is experiencing, and how can I work with those most effectively. Okay, so as well as these event descriptors, the DSM also describes intrusions. This used to be called re-experiencing, and the other word that you may be familiar with is flashbacks. So intrusions, re-experiencing, and flashbacks are all exactly the same thing. And what I'll attempt to do in a few moments is give you a kind of a picture, a kind of felt sense of what it's like to experience intrusions arising from experiences of sexual violence. As well as that, symptoms of avoidance, and we'll talk a little bit about the lived experience of those as well. We're going to skip over the fourth one there and then move to issues with arousal and reactivity. And there's a lot of new research that's come about in the last decade or so that tells us a lot about what happens in the nervous system when people experience traumatic events and how that affects their later functioning. So I'm going to share some of that information with you as well. And then after that, we'll move back to alterations to cognition and mood. People who are avid readers of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, I'm sure there's many of us here, will know that that particular criterion is a new criterion. It was only introduced in the DSM-5, which was released in May 2013. So there's quite a lot of talk to have about alterations to cognitions and mood, because apparently if you had PTSD prior to May 2013, you didn't have alterations to your cognitions and mood, but after the 22nd, to be precise, of May 2013, you were then allowed to have alterations in your cognitions and mood as a product of PTSD. What I imagine the clinicians in the room will be saying is, people have had alterations to their cognitions and mood as a product of PTSD for years and years and years. And in fact, that's what I see all the time in terms of what's happening with the DSM, is it's catching up with clinical practice. And, you know, why not? Why not have it that way around? Okay, so if it's okay with you, we'll jump in and try to get a felt sense of what those impacts of sexual violence feel like. So the first set of impacts that I want to talk about is the impacts called intrusions. So intrusions are involuntary interruptions in what you are thinking, how you are feeling, and what you are remembering. If you are uninterrupted by trauma, then most of the time your thoughts will be about what is happening in your current situation. So your thoughts will be about this presentation, this conference, what you're having for dinner tonight, relevant things that are pertinent to this time and place that you are currently occupying. If, however, you have experienced trauma, then sometimes thinking and feeling is not in response to what is in your current time and place. So when you are attending to issues and circumstances relating to this current time and place that you are in, you are said to be oriented to time and place. And that's a normal way of functioning, a so-called normal way of functioning. But when you've experienced trauma, sometimes those traumatic impacts can hijack what you are thinking, what you are feeling, and what you are remembering. And what they hijack those things with is recall of the traumatic events that took place. So you can find yourself suddenly thinking about the traumatic events. You can find yourself suddenly feeling the way you felt during the traumatic events. And you can find yourself remembering aspects of those traumatic events. It's not something you do deliberately. Intrusions are called intrusions because they come to you and they take over your cognitions, your feelings, and your memories. One of the key indicators of intrusions is that they're actually difficult to put aside. So you can have an intrusion, say you start thinking about a traumatic event, and then you realise that you're thinking about a traumatic event. You can put that thought aside and try to focus on what is in front of you. But what commonly happens with an intrusion is before long you find yourself thinking about that particular traumatic event again. So most of the time we hear about intrusions happening when people are awake. People describe them as flashbacks. People sometimes describe them as, I think I'm going crazy because it's like it's happening again all the time. And for a lot of people, these types of symptoms can be very worrying and very concerning to them, that sanity might be not okay at that point in time. And the reason for that is because it seems like these thoughts and these feelings and these memories are not within the person's control. It also looks like they just arrive unbidden with no kind of trigger to them. That's actually not the case. There is always a trigger that produces intrusions. Sometimes it's an internal trigger, so like a feeling. Sometimes it's an external trigger, seeing something that is reminiscent in some way of the traumatic event. So mostly we hear about intrusions happening when people are awake, but they also do happen when people are asleep. When people are asleep, intrusions show up as disturbing dreams or nightmares, often very highly distressing nightmares, the sorts of nightmares that you wake up bolt upright in bed in a cold sweat about. And if you examine the nightmares, what you will often find is that there is either content or themes that are similar to the experiences of sexual violence that that person really experienced in life. Okay? In order to really understand the experience of intrusions, we need to dig down a little bit into understanding human memory. So let's do that for just a few moments. When we talk about memory, we talk about it as if it is one thing. I have a memory of X, Y, or Z, okay? But memory actually isn't just one thing. In fact, I'm going to propose a radical suggestion for you that you have at least 7 different types of memory. The first type of memory that I want to introduce you to is called narrative memory. And this is what most people are talking about when they talk about memory as one thing. Narrative memory, excuse me, is what happened in what order. Okay? So it's a sequence of events. Essentially, it is the memory that you use to tell a story. This happened first, this happened in the middle, and then the whole thing ended up in this way. Okay? So every event that you encounter in life, you will lay down narrative memory about that event. We'll save the conversation about whether you have pre-verbal memory. That's a whole nother conversation that we won't get into just now. But for the sake of our purposes today, every event that you experience in life, you lay down narrative memory about. So this moment right now that you are experiencing, you are currently laying down narrative memory about this event of being at this conference and listening to this conversation. Okay? But as well as narrative memory, you also have all of these other different types of memory. Emotion memory or emotional memory is the memory of how you felt during the event that you're laying down in memory. So just take a moment, check in with yourself and notice, what is that emotional memory that's being laid down right now? Maybe you feel comfortable. Maybe you feel uncomfortable. Maybe you feel bored. Maybe you feel uncomfortable because you're too full from lunch. There's a variety of different options, but whatever it is, you will be laying down that emotional memory as we speak. As well as emotional memory and narrative memory, you also have memory that comes from each of the 5 senses. So you have visual memory, memory of what you saw. If you close your eyes right now and ask yourself, what colours am I wearing? You'll probably get some of them right, okay? Because you have already laid down memory of, actually that's a bad question to ask when I'm like 5 foot almost nothing and standing behind a pulpit, isn't it? There you go. But you will have a visual memory of what's in the room around you. So if you closed your eyes right now, you would probably be able to work out from your memory who is sitting next to you, where the door is in relation to where you're sitting, who else is present in the room with you. Maybe you might remember what colour the carpet is, maybe you might not, but there'll be lots of memory that you have accessible to you purely as a result of the visual memory that you have been laying down throughout this morning and the first part of this afternoon. So, narrative memory, emotional memory, visual memory. As well as that, you have memory of what you heard, memory of what you smelt, memory of what you tasted. My prominent one is the scones from this morning. And you also have somatosensory memory, which is the memory that's given to us through our skin. So memory of pressure or sensation and temperature. The memory of sitting in this chair that you are sitting on, that's somatosensory memory. When we lay down these 7 different types of memory, which we do for every event that we encounter in life, they get stored in very, very slightly different places in the brain. But when you lay down memory, these 7 different types of memory about non-traumatic events, what happens is there is a connecting dotted line that goes between each aspect of the memory that you're laying down. So your memory buddies know where their other buddies are. The memory of this conference, this moment, there are links between your narrative memory, your visual memory, your auditory memory, your emotional memory, etc., etc. Okay? And that's how memory should work. So I did say this is going to be interactive, and it's time for the first interactive piece. Are you feeling pro-social right now? Okay, that's a good thing. So, in just a moment, but not yet, I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and have a quick but equitable negotiation about who will be the teller and who will be the listener, okay? And then once you have had that swift but equitable negotiation, I would like the teller to tell the person next to you a story about your dinner last night. Now, if your dinner last night was a shameful drive-through of McDonald's, you can just pretend that that happened the night before, okay? And use the memory from the night before. This is not an exercise in shame and humiliation. It's just an exercise in memory, okay? So in just a moment, but not yet, when you have negotiated with the person next to you who's going to be telling the story and who's going to be listening, there are 3 things that I want you to accomplish together. The first one is the teller spends 3 to 4 minutes, and I'll let you know when the time's up, to tell your partner a story of your dinner last night, and try to include each of these different aspects of memory. Okay, and I'll put this slide back up when we get started, so you've got the prompts there and you can look at that slide and remember those different types of memory. And then listeners, when the story has finished, after 3 or 4 minutes, I want you to reflect back to your partner which aspects of memory you heard. I heard the narrative. I heard the taste memory. I heard the smell memory. I didn't hear the emotional memory. I didn't hear somatosensory memory. Okay? And then tell us, I want you to reflect back to your partner how easy it was for you to gather different aspects of your memory of dinner last night to tell a comprehensive story for 3 to 4 minutes. If it was easy for you to go find all of these different types of memory, that means that it's unlikely that your dinner last night was a traumatic event. Unlikely, not foolproof, not 100%, but unlikely. Let's consider what actually happens when we lay down memory when traumatic events do take place. So given that it's the past, your dinner last night, and you know that this did not happen, I just want you to lightly consider, what if a helicopter had crashed through the roof of the building that you were dining in last night? The building had been reduced to rubble. People had been seriously harmed. There were sirens, there was dust, there was poor visibility, there was extreme levels of distress. In that situation, you may have been traumatised. And in traumatic situations, we still lay down each of these 7 different types of memory. They're laid down in exactly the same places in the brain, in exactly the same ways. The one thing that is different is the little kind of dotted line that connects up all those different aspects of memory. So if I asked you to tell me the story of your dinner last night when it was a traumatic event, probably what you would say is something like, I can't really remember what we were having. Oh no, there was peas. I remember these really bright green peas. I remember that. And I might say, uh-huh. And you might say, I'm trying to remember who was there. I guess my family was there, but I don't actually remember them being there. How did you feel during that event? I'm not sure. I just have this really strong sense of distress. And that'd be it. That'd probably be about all that you could deliver. And the reason that you could only deliver that is because you can't find the pathway between one memory and the other aspects of memory. So one aspect of memory can't find its buddies, okay? And so there is a theory. There's not enough research at the moment to kind of suggest that this theory is right, but I find it quite a persuasive theory, I have to say. There's a theory that intrusions are little pieces of memory in the brain that are firing, trying to find its buddies. And that theory suggests that intrusions or flashbacks or re-experiencing symptoms, whatever you want to call them, are actually a healing mechanism within the mind or within the brain. So, like I said, we don't know. We don't know if that's actually the case just yet, but it's one explanation that makes sense to me for why intrusions happen. The lived experience of intrusions, though, the really important thing to consider is that when people have intrusions, it feels to them like the traumatic event is actually taking place again. It feels exactly the same as it did the first time, or at least almost exactly the same as it did the first time. And therein lies one of the really, really unfair things from my perspective about traumatisation, which is that people don't just need to recover from the initial real traumatic event that took place, but they have repeated experiences of that same traumatic event in the form of intrusions moving forward. So traumatisation isn't like one event. It seems like it's multiple events over time. How do we go with intrusions? Have we kind of got a sense of that little bit? Great. Okay. So let's move on to avoidance symptoms, the third of the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And avoidance is a product of human beings' hard wiring to avoid stuff that hurts. Okay, you're all hardwired to avoid stuff that is painful. It's a good way to be. Don't try and get rid of it. Very difficult to get rid of that inbuilt mechanism. There are currently some military operations that are investigating ways to do that. That's a whole bunch of Machiavellian stuff that we won't dig into today. So if you are hardwired to avoid pain and suffering, and intrusions equal pain and suffering, what you will do is you will avoid anything that brings you into contact with the emotions and the feelings and the thoughts and the memories that you have about the traumatic event that took place. So people might remind you of the traumatic event that took place. If you've experienced sexual violence, then your therapist will remind you about the traumatic event that took place. Other people who know about your experience of trauma are people who you will be motivated to avoid. And those who work with traumatised people, which is probably just about everybody here, will know that sometimes people don't show up at their appointments. Sometimes people want to avoid engaging with therapeutic endeavours altogether, and that's a very natural and normal part of recovery from trauma, because avoidance is a key symptom, a key factor, a key impact of traumatisation. So people can remind us of traumatic events that we've experienced. Places can remind us of traumatic events that we've experienced. Doing certain activities can remind us about traumatic events. Having particular thoughts can remind us of traumatic events. Having certain conversations can remind us of traumatic events. And even having particular emotions can remind us of traumatic events. And whenever we have one of those experiences that brings us near to intrusions or near to the experience of traumatisation that has occurred, we will be motivated to avoid it. So what happens over time is that the things that a person can tolerate become thinner and thinner and thinner. I can't go out, I can't talk to men, I can't work, I can't go to university, I can't socialise with my friends, I can't be out in public, I can't. All because the experience of intrusions is so unsettling, so that a person will avoid multiple things in order to make life feel like it's kind of okay. And again, here lies a problem also for a person who's experienced sexual violence, because they don't just have to recover from the sexual violence that took place once, they also have to recover from the multiple intrusions that take place over time after that sexual violence. And they have to do that within the constraints of a life that is getting thinner and thinner and thinner. Okay? And that's a very, very difficult task. Let's turn to arousal. So arousal is about activation in the nervous system, and there's an awful lot to talk about here. So I'm going to try to keep it reasonably brief. The DSM-5 talks about hyper and chronic arousal producing symptoms like hypervigilance, insomnia, exaggerated startle response, and difficulties concentrating, okay? So all of these things, hypervigilance is just waiting for something bad to happen. Exaggerated startle response is having an overreaction to something that you didn't know was going to happen, like, oh God, I didn't know you were there, that kind of thing. That's an exaggerated startle response. Difficulties with sleeping, difficulties with concentration, when the system is really souped up it's really difficult to be still and get the mind to calm down enough to either focus or fall asleep. So the DSM-5 talks about these symptoms, and all of these symptoms are coming from dysregulated activation of the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system, you've all heard of, it's that fight and flight response, yeah? Where your body kind of soups up, your nervous system changes how your body operates, your pupils dilate, your breathing increases, your heart pumps faster to get lots of oxygenated blood to the big muscles in your body so that you can either fight off a dangerous situation or run the hell away from a dangerous situation, okay? And that's all fairly kind of familiar to us all. When a person's experienced a dangerous event like sexual violence, their nervous system will likely move into sympathetic nervous system activation. They will move into fight or flight. And if that sympathetic nervous system activation is sufficient to resolve that dangerous situation, they get away, the traumatisation doesn't occur, they survive and they're fine afterwards, then they will likely not be traumatised. So human beings have this inbuilt sympathetic nervous system is meant to help you survive traumatic events or stressful events, dangerous events, and stay alive and kicking and just fine, okay? And most of the time when people come across highly stressful events, that's exactly what happens. Sympathetic nervous system kicks in, they're able to do something to get away from that situation, they survive, they don't get PTSD, and everything's fine. It's when the sympathetic nervous system activation does not resolve that dangerous situation and the person remains subjected to that dangerous situation that traumatisation takes place. When the inbuilt mechanism that's meant to deal with it can't resolve it, that's when we get traumatisation. And when that happens, it's like the central nervous system kind of resets itself. And have you ever had a light switch in your house that's a little bit dicky and it kind of never quite switches off properly? It's sort of like it switches on and then you can kind of press the off and the light will go off, but you have this sense that just a hair's weight on that light switch would flick it back into on again. Do you know what I'm talking about there? Okay, so it's like the nervous system does exactly that. It's like it resets to a place where it only takes a tiny little bit of stress for that nervous system to go poof straight back into sympathetic nervous system activation, okay? So what happens after that is a little stressor comes along and the person moves straight up into sympathetic nervous system activation. And we get overreactions, heightened reactions to low-level stresses. Okay, so that's the sympathetic nervous system. What the DSM-5 doesn't talk about is parasympathetic nervous system activation, and that's important too. So in order to understand parasympathetic nervous system activation, I'm going to invite you to take a little imaginary trip with me to the African savannah. Your friend Jeffrey, the gazelle, is grazing out on the African savannah with the rest of the herd. And it's a beautiful sunny day out on the African savannah. And what Jeffrey and the other gazelles don't know is that there is a lioness who is very hungry just beyond that patch of grass over there. The lioness, at the time that feels right to her for whatever reason, decides to give chase to this herd of gazelles. And in the process of that chase, the herd of gazelles moves into sympathetic nervous system activation, okay? You will see eyeballs getting bigger, nostrils flaring, lots of blood flow to the large muscles in the legs. The herd is mobilizing in defense against this danger that is now present. The lioness sets her sights on Jeffrey. Poor Jeffrey. And I advise you at this point in time to hold your friendship, your imaginary friendship with Jeffrey gently, okay? I invite you to engage in this imaginary trip down the African savannah just kind of gently, okay? Don't immerse yourself too far. Because the lioness has set her sights on Jeffrey and decided that Jeffrey's gonna be dinner. And so Jeffrey knows at some point that he's been singled out. His sympathetic nervous system activation reaches its height, and the blood flow is pumping through his body. His legs are taking him faster than he has ever run before. His eyes are really, really, really wide. You've seen this on David Attenborough, I'm sure. And you can see his eyes actually rolling from side to side, which is an orienting response of your sympathetic nervous system trying to get as much information from the environment as it possibly can in order to secure your escape from this dangerous situation. But the lioness is too quick. And she reaches Jeffrey, and she reaches up with her huge frame and has her paws on Jeffrey's hind, and Jeffrey kicks like crazy with his back legs, hooves thudding into the lioness's ribcage really powerfully. But the claws get into Jeffrey's hind, and his knees hit the floor. He's not dead. He's not yet. He's not. He's not even seriously injured yet. His sympathetic nervous system hasn't run out of energy, but something changes, and he stops kicking, and he stops trying to run. He could still run, he could still kick, but he doesn't. What happens at this point in time is Jeffrey's parasympathetic nervous system becomes activated. And the parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite to the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system goes, whoa. Parasympathetic nervous system goes, whoa, close down, okay? So physically what happens is the blood drains from the extremities of his body into the torso, making his sensation and feeling in the extremities of his body much, much less than it usually would be, which I think you will agree with me is a good thing if you have a lioness who's onto your hind legs, yeah? At the same time, what happens in the mind is the kind of perceptual awareness closes down. And it's like the rest of the herd and the African savanna move further and further away from Jeffrey's consciousness. A vagueness kind of comes over him, and he submits to his death. Sorry, Jeffrey. So, parasympathetic nervous system activation is another inbuilt, innate process within every creature's, I don't know about insects, haven't got that far, but within every animal's nervous system structure. Just as we have a sympathetic nervous system which helps us to fight off danger and stay alive, we also have a parasympathetic nervous system that helps us to prepare for death. And at the moment of a lioness killing a gazelle out on the African savanna, you jolly well want your parasympathetic nervous system to kick in, huh? But what happens for people who experience sexual violence, who move into that sympathetic nervous system activation and that isn't sufficient to resolve the dangerous situation, is sometimes they move further into parasympathetic nervous system activation. And what happens then is the body starts to close down and the mind starts to close down, okay? And you will hear stories from rape survivors of saying things like, it was like it wasn't really happening to me. That's parasympathetic nervous system activation. Or I floated up to the ceiling and just watched the whole thing and I didn't feel very affected by it. That's parasympathetic nervous system activation. So there's this second nervous system process that happens that's really important for us to know about when we're working with people who've experienced sexual violence, because the same dicky light switch thing happens. when you have moved into parasympathetic nervous system activation, what happens is the nervous system resets itself and it makes it super, super easy for you to move back into parasympathetic nervous system activation again into the future. The window that I have here is an analogy that was given to us by Dan Siegel in the late 90s. Some of you will be familiar with his work, comes from neurobiology. And one of the most important things that Dan Siegel told us about traumatization is the window kind of represents the top and bottom limits of your nervous system's capacity to remain okay. Okay, so when you have sympathetic nervous system arousal, your arousal goes up, 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 and then pops out of the window. And as soon as you pop out of the window, what happens is something changes in the way that your brain operates. And I'll tell you more about that in just a few moments. With parasympathetic nervous system activation, what happens is your arousal goes down, down, down in a preparation for death until it pops out of the window down here. Any time your arousal in your nervous system is out of the window, whether it's up or whether it's down, you have decreased capacity in terms of particular functions in your brain. More about those in just a moment, okay? How are we traveling, all right? Okay, cool. So I want to turn to the last criterion of PTSD before we tuck a little bit into that neurobiology stuff. So, alterations to cognitions and mood, the criterion that came about in May. So here's some words on the screen that come from the DSM-5. Blah, 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 bloody, blah, blah. You know, some stuff there. For me, it isn't very interesting. And it isn't very interesting because what's being described here is the DSM-5's first attempt to articulate what the alterations to cognitions and mood look like. And anybody's first attempt at articulating something is generally not great, okay? And I would say the same about that, okay? But what I can, what I think is a better articulation of what happens to people's cognitions and mood post-sexual violence is explained by two American psychiatrists called Karen Sorquitney and Lorianne Perlman, who back in the mid-90s proposed a way of explaining how cognitions and mood get interrupted by traumatic exposure. There are two theories that we need to just briefly understand in order to get a grip on how that happens. And the first one is called constructivism. So constructivism is this idea that there is real life out there that happens, and there is a structure that I have in my mind that is everything I know about life. And when I meet life, when something happens, I use all the information I have about life in order to make sense of what it is that's going on out there. There's a two-way street though, which is that sometimes I'll come across something new in life, and at that point in time I can choose to interpret it according to what I have in my head already, or I can choose to change what I have in my head to accommodate this new piece of information out there. So if I have a frame of reference in my head that says all pigs are pink, and then I go walking in the Northern Territory one day and this little critter crosses my path and it's got trotters and a pushed-in nose and a wiggly tail, but it's grey, then I have a problem between my experience of life and my structure of reference within my head that doesn't fit. I can either decide to incorporate the knowledge that pigs can be grey as well as pink, or I can decide that's not a pig, okay? This is a real event, and I'm very happy to say that I was able to incorporate the knowledge that sometimes pigs can be grey as well as pink. Who knew? So that's constructivism. The second theory that we need to understand is a theory about when human beings reach their most highest capability psychologically. And not so very long ago, research was telling us that your best psychological capacities are reached at the age of 18. Now I invite you to just consider that for a moment and see what happens inside. Then we discovered that the frontal lobe of the brain is not fully developed until somewhere between the age of 25 and 35. And so we went, oh, okay, well, so then your most capable psychological capacities must be somewhere between 25 and 35. Now, those of you in the room who, along with me, have passed the age of 35 will be happy to hear that research has moved on, and we're now much more aware of what's called brain plasticity, and with one exception, which is disorders of cognitive decline like Alzheimer's, human beings reach their psychologically most capable point just a moment before you die. Now, whether you find that comforting or somewhat distressing is up to you, and I invite you to consider that, what the meaning of that is a little later on, should you choose to. Okay, so if we put these two theories together, this idea that there is reality, but there's also this structure in our heads that makes sense of reality, and that we are always developing our psychological capacities throughout the entire lifespan, then what we can understand is that when we come across traumatic events, when we are traumatized by things, trauma exposure interrupts the naturally developing psychological capacities and interrupts the constructivist process skewing our thoughts, ideas, and beliefs. Okay, cognitions are just thoughts, ideas, and beliefs, that's all. So what will happen is you will get changes in your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs about yourself, about the world, about others in it, and about how things work. So a couple of examples. Our ideas about the world being a generally safe place and people being generally kind of nice can be disrupted when we experience cruelty from those close to us. Our ideas about being a worthy person just inherently because we are can be hijacked when we're repeatedly treated poorly by those who profess to love us. For me, that's a better explanation of how cognitions can be altered as a product of exposure to traumatic material. And Sorquitney and Perlman, in their research, suggest that there are 5 key areas that get adjusted. That is cognitions relating to safety, cognitions relating to trust, to intimacy or connectedness with ourselves and others, to control, how much control we actually have around what happens in life, and to esteem or sense of worth. Each of these can relate to the self or relate to other people, but what the research is starting to tell us is that when we are talking about adjustments to cognitions that occur for people who've experienced sexual violence, it is predominantly the cognitions relating to self that change. So what results is cognitions like, I am not safe, I cannot be trusted, I am disconnected from myself, I am not in control, I am not worthy. Those are the sorts of cognitions that arise from sexual violence traumatization. One very interesting thing that I invite you to investigate, there was a recent study by Carper and associates, including one of the researchers at the University of New South Wales, which discovered that negative cognitions about the self following sexual assault predict the entire later severity of post-traumatic stress disorder. So what that's saying is, if straight after sexual violence you feel badly about yourself and you think badly about yourself, your trajectory of post-traumatic stress disorder is likely to be much more difficult than your trajectory of post-traumatic stress disorder would likely be if you didn't have those cognitions. Which leads me to conclude, hey, we need to be really, really mindful of what's going on in people's minds post-sexual violence, not just what their presenting issues are, okay? Okay, let's talk about that neurobiology piece that I said we would talk about. So this research comes from Dan Siegel, Bessel van der Kolk, a number of other researchers. And what this research has demonstrated is that the prefrontal cortex, which is that red bit up there, goes offline when the nervous system, including the brain, is being traumatized, and also when it's tricked into thinking that it's being traumatized again. When it's got that dicky light switch thing, and a little stressor happens and it moves into activation in terms of the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system again. So stress occurs after an unresolved traumatic event and triggers the same responses that happen during traumatization. The problem is that when that happens, the prefrontal cortex goes offline, and the prefrontal cortex gives you your ability to problem solve, your ability to plan, your ability to analyze, and your ability to use logic. Okay, so when a person who's experienced sexual violence comes to a helping professional to get some assistance with how they feel or how they're thinking or what's happening in their life, they will traditionally be provided with some sort of talk therapy, yeah? Talk therapy is my prefrontal cortex to your prefrontal cortex. But if your prefrontal cortex is offline, then what it sounds like is blah, 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 or it might as well, okay? And we can say all these things like, it's not your fault. It wasn't your fault. You're not to blame for what happened. But if the prefrontal cortex isn't online, that logic goes nowhere. And therein lies, I think, a critical double bind for people who've been traumatized by sexual violence, especially those with a more complex pattern of traumatization. To recover using the traditional models that we use, they need to have exactly what is not available. Okay? Traditional models of working with people who've experienced sexual violence sit them in a room to talk with another human being in a logical manner. But inside the brain, the bit that relates to logic is not happening, and the base levels of the brain are going nuts. Okay? So traditional talk therapies don't work. How do you talk with an absent cortex? How do you help somebody who doesn't have that prefrontal cortex online? I'm going to invite you to have a small discussion just at the table that you're sitting at, and just have a discussion about these 3 questions. How do you regulate a baby's nervous system? How do you settle your own jangled nerves some days? And how could you apply your answers to those questions to being effective in helping people who've been traumatized by sexual violence? Great, there's some lovely ideas here. So here's a pre-prepared list that I baked earlier for you. Helping people calm before attempting cognitive restructuring. And really a lot of that stuff is very simple stuff. It's about breathing. It's about having a sense of groundedness, having your feet on the floor, having a sensation with, just do this for 1 second. What do you feel through the soles of your feet? What is underneath the soles of your feet? What does it feel like? Can you really get in touch with that for a moment? And as you really get in touch with what you feel through the soles of your feet, just notice what else happens in your body and in your feelings. You've just grounded yourself to a greater or lesser degree, depending on where you were at and how well that worked for you. But all of those sorts of processes are just about helping people whose nervous system and limbic system is dysregulated to rework out, how do I regulate my own system? Incorporating movement and rhythm both in the session and also keeping that stuff going outside of sessions, so in between sessions too. Helping people get in touch with their own bodies. So as I say, think down through the soles of your feet. Some of you would have gone straight to focus your attention there, immediately would have had access to information. Other people would be going, what do you mean, think about my feet? What do you mean? Okay, different people have different levels of relationship with their bodies. Some of us are really in there. Some of us are really not in there in our bodies. The more you can feel and notice within your body, the more ability you have to regulate your own activation in your nervous system. So really what we're doing is we're helping people learn how to regulate their systems. And what we always want to do is we want to create the experience that we're trying to create, which might be stillness, or it might be groundedness, or it might be containment, or it might be strength, or it might be stability, or it might be solidity. It might be a whole bunch of different things. We want to create that sensation in the body and then go to the head rather than the other way around. Here's some quick reminders of what we've talked about today. Intrusions feel like it's happening again. The urge to avoid is present around therapy as well as every other aspect of life. Arousal dysregulation is sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. While the prefrontal cortex is offline, talk therapy can't work. Develop regulation skills before attending to cognitions. And the best sexual violence therapists are experts in their own nervous system regulation. Okay? In fact, I would say anybody who's working with traumatized individuals should get really good at that stuff we were just talking about. How you regulate your own activation in your nervous system first.